Good morning, everyone. For those who are just joining us, welcome to Intellect's Mental Health Festival 2025. I'm Aisha, your MC for today's session, and I can't believe how we're already at our second last session for the APAC segment of the festival. Gosh, how did time pass by so quickly? Well, we're going to make the best use of your time with this upcoming session, Designing for Neurodiversity, How to Build Spaces That Work for Everyone. Now, we all know that no two minds are alike, yet many jobs and work environments assume that they are. And so in this next session, we have a neurodivergent individual, an HR leader, and an expert sharing practical tips for building more inclusive spaces. But first, a gentle reminder. Today's session may touch on sensitive topics that may be emotionally challenging for some. Mental health can be a deeply personal and moving subject. And so if at any point you feel uncomfortable or overwhelmed, please do not hesitate to reach out to one of our team members and let them know. We're all here to support you. And so I'd like to introduce to you our moderator for the session, Hannah Lowe, the Deputy Product Marketing Lead here at Intellect. And joining her would be our panel of speakers. Sara Lee San Jose, the Head of Culture and Diversity, Inclusion and Belonging at Prudential. Ashley Wu, Sales Director at Forter and a neurodiverse individual. And last but not least, Sandy Tong, Clinical Psychologist at Intellect. All right, so without further ado, take it away, Hannah.
Thanks so much, Aisha. And yes, it's really a pleasure to be here today. As Aisha mentioned, we'll be tackling a really important truth that no two minds are alike, yet many organizations, workplaces, and communities are still designed as if they are. In this session, let's reimagine what it takes to build spaces that don't just accommodate neurodiverse individuals, but truly thrive because of them. And you may be wondering, what is this lens that Hannah is bringing to the table? Well, like many of you, I am probably someone who is just exploring and here to learn and dive deeper into this topic. I am in no means an expert, but I'm so glad to be joined by real experts here today, as well as a neurodiverse individual himself. So thank you to my three panelists here. Maybe you can just kick us off with a quick introduction. Sara, why don't you start first? Quick intro and maybe a fun fact about yourself.
Okay, thanks, Hannah. Hi, I'm Sara. One of the biggest values or traits that I have is curiosity. And I think that trait serves me well in my role as head of culture, diversity, inclusion, and belonging at Prudential Assurance. So, curiosity, because, I am in a legacy company. It's like over a 100-year-old company. So there are set ways of doing things. And I'm always curious about what work looks like now in the context of a long, historic kind of environment. And how do we bring people together in the modern workplace while appreciating their differences? So in my job, I bring the human element onto the table because that is part of the business discussions. Fun fact, if I were food, I would be curry puff because on any given day, you don't know if you're getting tuna, chicken and mushroom, or curry puff potato. So that would be me in a nutshell.
Love that. Thanks, Sarah. That is a very fun fact, and I love curry puffs. I think chicken curry is my favorite filling. All right, Ashley, can you give us a quick introduction?
Yes, sure. Hi, everyone. I'm Ashley. Currently, I'm in doing sales basically in Forter, which is enterprise selling to enterprises. But my past experiences have been quite diverse. I have been in very early stage startups as employee number 3, to larger public companies, and these companies operate very differently. So I've had the opportunity to learn how these companies people operate and trying to adapt to these places. Fun fact is, in my earlier years in education, I almost quit school 3 times to pursue completely different things. One was professional gaming, and then into fine dining, and then a few other things, right? And so like this is something that I continue to do every day. I keep finding new hobbies to try and quit my work or main type of work around. Yeah.
Thanks for sharing that. I think we can have a chat after this. I'd love to hear more about those hobbies. And thank you so much for, coming on this panel to really share your experience and be vulnerable with us. We really appreciate it. All right, Sandy, last but not least, could you share a bit about yourself?
Thanks, Hannah. Hi, everyone. I'm Sandy. I'm a clinical psychologist. I work at Intellect, so I'm an in-house clinician. I work with population from young children to youths to adults and older adults. And currently, I'm seeing clients across the various ages. A fun fact for me is I recently took up the violin and practicing hard to try and play a song, and I hope to eventually. So I'm really happy to be here today to speak about such an important topic.
Awesome. Thanks, Cindy. You have to play for us one day. Okay, and as you can see here, we're joined by really different people, all here to talk about this topic of neurodiversity, right? Because building what matters means ensuring that mental health infrastructure accounts for every type of mind. Because when we design for inclusion, we unlock potential for everyone, right? But before we dive in, let's just start with the basics first. What even is neurodiversity? I think it's a term that we all hear a lot, but essentially what it means is that there's no single normal type of brain, right? So just like how we all look differently on the outside, our brains work differently on the inside. And that's exactly what neurodiversity means. Some of us process information faster or slower. Some of us are maybe more sensitive to sound or light or detail. Some of us need a lot of movement to focus, just like how I'm moving my hands right now. And some of us can just hyper focus for hours and be like staring at the screen, right? So, and these are all natural variations. It's not flaws. So, think about the last time you struggled to focus in a noisy room or when you had to maybe multitask and you felt overwhelmed. And now imagine that that's your everyday experience at work, in life, in social interactions. And that's what many neurodivergent people, such as those with ADHD, autism, or dyslexia, navigate all the time. And in most organizations, jobs are designed as if everyone's brain works the same way, but that's not true, right? And when we ignore those differences, we end up unintentionally excluding really talented people. And that's what we're here to unpack today, how to design workplaces and communities that truly work for everyone. And so to bring this to life, let's start by stepping into the shoes of a neurodivergent colleague. We're going to listen to a short simulation of what someone with ADHD might experience. And so, yeah, let's kick us off.
Still not had anything to eat today, so let's get that done really quick. What's this? Okay, Olivia, please clean the kitchen. Color orange. Okay, I can do that. Let's make sure the task board is updated. Yay! The kitchen, perfect. Okay, let's do the dishes first. So many. Once I put those in the dishwasher, most of the work will be over. Yay! Right, let's open this up. Gross. Those are still dirty. I never turned the dishwasher on yesterday. You're so forgetful. Nice. Okay, let's close this, start it, and we'll just hand wash the other dishes. I hate hand washing. Okay, so if I want to hand wash, I need the drying rack. Where did I put the drying rack? You're so irresponsible, you never put anything back in its place. Okay, well, I need to clear this stuff off before I can put the drying rack there, so let's put those away. I thought I found a person. Did I drink water today? Why did I only grab one thing? This pasta would taste. This cabinet is a mess. I think half this stuff is expired. All right. If I want any of the
pause here. So I'm not sure if you heard, but there were a lot of overlapping voices, a lot of distractions that were popping up. So I'd like to hear from everyone here in the room today. How did that feel? What word describes how that felt? Just for you, personally, watching. You can scan the QR code on the screen or use the link that my colleague has just dropped in the chat box. Just sharing how that felt for you. And while the responses are coming in, I'd like to ask Ashley here, when you watched that simulation, what resonated most with you?
For me, I guess the most common point is how quickly you will deviate from your original task. It's not uncommon for people to feel that way. I think everybody, to some degree, with enough distractions, will experience this. But I guess what's different is how susceptible, for example, I find myself to be when I compare against my peers, right? So for me, the analogy is like when you're trying to watch TV And imagine that every few seconds you're forced to change channels, like not by choice. And by the end of that whole thing, you need to figure out what happened in the original show, right? So yeah, that's what it feels like for me. And it becomes difficult to structure habits and work around the task you have to do.
Thanks, Ashley. And I think a lot of people here are also resonating with that, right? Some of the big words that are coming up are confusing, overwhelming, chaotic, messy. I think that is, yeah, it's all very relatable, right? When you're hearing that. And what you mentioned, right? How you need to kind of figure out what the original TV show was playing on. That's what you said. And that brings us to a deeper point about how we understand the word disability and how much of the challenge comes from the environment and not just the person. So for a long time, the way we think about conditions like ADHD or autism was through what's called the medical model or disease model. And I know these are terms that are quite big. So basically what the medical model is it's saying that the issue is on the individual, that they need to be the one to change or adapt and figure things out, right? So if you think about a kid with ADHD, they might be told in class to just focus harder or just learn to sit still. Why are you running around and causing chaos, right? Those are things that are still spoken today. But there is another way of looking at it that we want to explore here today, and that's called the social model. So this flips the script and says that maybe the environment is what needs to change too, not just the individual learning how to adapt, right? So instead of asking someone to sit through like a 3-hour meeting, can we design meetings to be shorter or more interactive? But I'd like to hear from Sandy, the expert here today. So can you just share a little bit more? What is the social model and what are the key differences between that and the medical model?
Thanks, Hannah. I think the key points about the social model is that it really views neurodiversity as having disability or having challenges brought about mainly by societal expectations and how society is constructed, both the environment and also our ways of doing things. And that is what causes what we see as disability or impairment for the individuals. And that versus the medical model, where the medical model, we focus on an individual's deficits or how they deviate from the norm or what we think is the normal brain. But contrary to popular belief, actually, none of us really knows what a normal brain is supposed to be. And that's why there's always a range or margin of error, right? And so how we diagnose ADHD in our setting is to kind of see to what extent do the differences contribute to functional impairments in the day-to-day. And a lot of this is actually a consequence or a product of what is being designed. So when I work with young children, I talk a lot to them about how it's not really an inherent deficit or there's nothing wrong with their brain, but essentially right now they're being diagnosed with the condition mainly because like the environment that they are meant to succeed in or thrive in is built in a way that is not friendly to how their brains work. And essentially that's the difference between these two ways of looking at it.
Right. Thanks so much, Sandy. Wow, I'm learning a lot today. And so what we're really saying is, like you said, there's no one normal type of brain, and it's really just maybe seeing how much it impacts your day-to-day life, right? And if we think about it, then what do you think is the impact to a neurodivergent individual or one who has been diagnosed as neurodivergent when they're viewed through the lens of a medical model versus the social model? Like what psychological risks or implications might happen as a result of this? Sandy, if you don't mind, yeah.
Sure, I think in the video, as you've heard, one of the voices tends to be a bit more critical. Like you're so forgetful, you're so lazy, you're not good at organizing. And a lot of times for individuals who are neurodiverse, they grow up hearing this kind of messaging from people around them, from feedback in schools, from teachers, unintentionally, right? From the adults around them who are hoping to help them to succeed in what they deem as success. And carrying a medical model, that's the consequence, right? Like you view it as a deficit, as something to fix. I see a lot of parents who are hoping that I can fix the problems that their child is facing in school. And I can do something about how they respond to the cues in their environment, or like how they are able to sit down and study in a way that is more typical, when that is not helpful to the child, because there's only so much you can do to change how the brain has been born and built to work. And so I think the consequences or the risk of like holding on to that medical model is that we unintentionally convey negative messages to how the individuals are not enough, or they should not be this way, or there's something wrong with them. Compared to if we were to hold the social model where we acknowledge that everybody is different, as you have mentioned before, and our job is to kind of see how to bring out the strengths and weaknesses, particularly the strengths, and help them to thrive in environments that will be more friendly to them and not become barriers in how they can succeed.
Thanks, Sandy. So it's really how, instead of just asking how do we change that person, or even asking that in the first place, it's how do we change environments so that they can thrive. And we'll talk a little bit more about that later, right, in universal design. But let's change to Sarah here. Let's take a pivot to the commercial environment. So from your experience in HR, how have you seen the medical model versus the social model impact processes or policies in workplaces? Maybe particularly in like career progression or hiring processes?
Yeah, the good thing is that we're now, I think I've seen a strong pivot away from the medical model, and the environment now uses terms that are really open to the social model. We talk about psychological safety, we talk about valuing differences, we talk about learning versus, appreciating learning from mistakes as opposed to playing the blame game. So I am seeing that in terms of at least the language as a first layer. If we're talking about from an HR perspective in terms of policies, the way I look at it, there's a hardware and software aspect to it. And I think maybe we'll be talking about some aspects later, but from the HR lens, you're seeing things. I remember when I was very young in my career, being interviewed or even doing interviews, and there was no guide. So really that is ripe for all of your subjective biases coming in. So all the things like if this person is seen as different, automatically all of your subjective biases come into play. So I think what we're seeing now, especially with the work of TAFEP, in terms of fairness in the workplace, we're seeing the use of interview assessment guides. So at least you're putting objectivity into it. It's linked into what's the qualifications required for the role, what are the skills required. And there are more assessment tools that are available. For example, like the one that Intellect has, which actually just, I think it evens out the playing field, because we know that humans are still doing the interviewing process. And anytime you have a human as part of the process, we all come with our lenses of how we look at the world. So putting those policies in place, like using assessment tools, simple interview guides, and so from a hiring policy, that's what's come in. In terms of once you're in the company, um, one of the things we've sort of really held on to in Prudential is our flexible work arrangement model. I'm really proud to say that despite all the shifts to come back to work, our guidance is minimum 2 days in the office as guidance. So we've still held on to flexibility, knowing that you don't really need to be sitting at a desk the entire time. And is that your best work? So these are small things. So I think um, the shift is there. It's just a matter of are companies willing to hold the line? Because there's always competing interest in terms of like business priorities. And so I think having this as part of the agenda, the people agenda, making sure our policies, we're always looking at our policies. We're revisiting what the office looks like. We're revisiting how we're asking people to work. And I think more importantly, how we're training our people so that they're using, and this comes with a lot of role modeling and training leaders, because these are the people who are assessing people coming in. So I think it's a very multifaceted arena. You're both looking at hardware and the software. But the good thing is the environment has shifted quite a lot over the last few years.
Thanks for sharing, Sarah. And I just remember even like in the early years of my career doing in-person interviews, one of the key things that interviewers often look at is like, do you have eye contact the whole time? You know, how much do you sit still or present yourself
Yes.
physically and all of that. But yeah, like you mentioned, those are all very traditional ways of looking at it, or backdated ways, right? And so how can we shift that and maybe use different tools and interview guides to change the way these things are done? And in the workplace as well, having different accommodations to different types of things, and that constant evaluation of what you're putting in the workplace, right? I'd like to hear from Ashley. How have you personally felt these models at play in your career journey or even in general life?
Thanks, Anna. At least for me, the reality is that these processes or these ways of measurement is quite standard, right? And it's going to take time to change. My line of work tends to be a bit more competitive and cutthroat, so there is less margin to be different from what is prescribed as good or ideal as a candidate in this space. So I guess if you can't change that, then it's at least important to be aware of how you might be sending wrong signals. Then you need to clarify your intentions. So in the earlier days, I realized that some of the things I was doing, it really just sent a very different signal of what my intent is. And it took me some time to understand how to adapt and clarify with, say, my manager, for example. So I guess if you find that you're unable to fit into any prescribed model of working, then it's important to manage basically your stakeholders' expectations of what, when, and how you can deliver something to people. Yeah, and I guess one thing that's commonly overlooked is the fact that it's not only how you are reacting to the environment. Sometimes your team manager is the one experiencing these issues, and how you're behaving as a team member can affect them differently. So the better you can adapt to that, the better your experience will be. So for example, personally, when I was managing a team, I knew that I operated with a slightly different tempo, right? And I made sure when teams were onboarding, when we were going through training, that I let them know that this was how I operate. And I also extend that flexibility both ways, right? I know my strengths and weaknesses, they will have theirs. And we're just very aware of what each other is doing. And we will also make sure to call out when one of us is doing something that's not helpful in how we operate, right? So I think it's just important for that for you to know that you as a team manager, how you operate affects your team members. And then so when you are one of those team members contributing, just be aware of how you're submitting work, how you're communicating work, will really help in this regard. Yeah.
Thanks for sharing that. And like you said, it works both ways. And if I'm hearing correctly, so there are two sides to this, as we're still exploring the medical and social model. On the medical side, in a way, you still have to over communicate, right? You're still always needing to manage expectations. And I can imagine that sometimes can feel like quite a lot to have to do. And I'm sorry if I'm assuming, but that's how it sounds to me. But what I'm hearing also is making sure that organizations or teams have that opportunity for you to be vulnerable enough or be open enough and be able to voice these things and not get penalized for it. So creating that understanding environment and just that environment to be yourself and make sure that people are cooperative or people are adaptable to the different working styles that we all have, right? Okay, let's move to a quick poll here. So to the audience, based on everything you've heard so far, let's hear on a scale of 1 to 5, how inclusive do you feel your organization currently is for neurodiverse colleagues? And just as a reminder, you can scan the QR code in the top right corner of the screen or click on the link that my colleague has just dropped in the chat. Great, we'll give maybe a few seconds here. I'd like to hear maybe some barriers that people are seeing, but it's good to see already we are split between slightly inclusive and moderately inclusive, okay, but we still do have organizations that are not at all inclusive. But it's also great to see about 6% of us here have organizations that are fully inclusive. That's great. Right, let's go to the next question then. What do you think is the biggest barrier to neuro inclusion in your organization or community currently? Yeah, sorry. Yes, thank you. Polls up on the screen. So what do you think is the biggest barrier to neuro inclusion in your organization or community? And when we say community, just think about, the other non-work organizations that you may be in, whether that's in the community that you live in, or maybe you volunteer at, religious organizations. Okay, we're seeing here that the top voted one is a lack of awareness and understanding that people just don't know enough about neurodiversity. That's very, very valid. I think I myself, like I said, I'm learning a lot in this panel today as well. Rigid policies, we see lack of practical tools or resources. And yeah, I think it all ties back to the first point, right? Like we have a lack of awareness. All of these things are hard to then shape and to build these inclusive workplaces and communities. Okay, let's then move on to the practical solutions and scenarios. So it's one thing to talk about it and to have that awareness, but it's another thing to actually put it into practice. So Sara, question for you. From an HR standpoint, what policies can companies implement to better support neurodiverse employees? And I know you alluded to it a little bit earlier, but let's dive into that further.
So I think one important policy is really work arrangements, because it's the day-to-day lived experience of our people. If you're hired, you come in, but you can't perform because the environment doesn't accommodate the different way in which you operate, then it doesn't work. So for me, because a lot of things can flow from that, but once you have the environment, for example, in Prudential, we have libraries on every floor. These are no speaking zones. We have a Thrive room, which also doubles up as our prayer room, where you can actually go if you're overstimulated. It doubles as a meditation room. No questions asked. The entrance and exit is subtle. So that already, because the built environment, the hardware will tell your people, okay, this company truly believes in supporting different ways of working, different ways of thinking. So I think that one is important. Flexible work arrangement, I think, is one key policy. And I know that there's been so much talk about coming back to the office, but that flexibility, I think, really makes a difference for neurodiverse individuals, because the workplace can just be really overwhelming. It is meant for connection. And I think the challenge is, how do we make sure that we institutionalize other ways of connecting, like online coffee talks? So I think for me, if you ask from a just pure HR perspective, it would be around the built environment. It would be around flexible work. And third, and which is I think really important, is how are you training your leaders? How are you making it part of the culture to talk about differences? And I think one way of doing that is, and that's why I liked the poll earlier where awareness was the number one barrier. There are ways now that allow us to talk about it in a way that's accessible. For example, talking about psychological safety. I mean, if you look at it, the principles are, it's safe to speak, safe to take a risk, safe to make mistakes. These are all things that safe to have a different view. These are all things that, if you look at it on the surface, it's just talking about, oh, creating a safe environment for all. But if you look at it closely, this kind of culture is actually the environment where a neurodiverse individual can speak. Like Ashley was talking about having to over communicate their needs. You can only, or how they operate, so that, people understand. That only happens if you have an environment that actually allows you to speak. So I think there's so many ways to look at it, but um, there's a lot in play, I think, is my answer to this. It's not a single policy. It's going to be a multitude. It's a Rambo approach.
Thanks, Sarah. So to summarize, it's about flexible work arrangements or just building environments that accommodate the different way that people work. Awareness is one thing, but then how can we continue to institutionalize these kind of practices that actually help the individual? But I'm just curious to hear, do you think it's the responsibility of the HR to be doing this education? Of course, HR can help to design different policies and the environments, but what about the awareness aspect?
The reality is, it will always usually come from the HR function, just to be pragmatic. But what I find important is, are your leaders talking about it? Are your leaders actually doing storytelling about it? So we've been lucky that we have neurodiverse leaders or people in senior management who have actually felt safe enough to have videos sharing their experiences, because that one is a game changer when you see it top down and you see very prominent individuals in the company sharing their very personal stories. It that already opens up the conversation. So it's a shared responsibility. What I'm seeing from a practical perspective is, it's likely going to be HR driven, but I think actually role modeling by leaders, once you've got leader buy-in, leaders talking about it, and leaders really being vulnerable about it, that is what changes.
Right. So it's not just the responsibility of the HR. Leaders also have a role to play here for that top-down influence and leadership. All right. Thanks, Sarah. And to Sandy, so beyond policies, what changes in workplace design or systems have the biggest impact based on the work that you have done? And this idea of universal design, maybe explain a little bit, what does that mean and how does it come in?
Thanks, Hannah, for the question. Universal design was something that I had the privilege to witness firsthand when I was working in early intervention, when they were discussing building a new center. And I've learned that what it really means is not really designing just for one specific population, and to hold anybody can use the designs that have been put in place. So for example, now in HDBs, right, in the toilets, you rarely have a curb. In the new BTOs, it's a slight little ramp, which benefits all users. So elderly individuals who have difficulty navigating steps, those who are wheelchair users, and parents, who need to wheel their kids into the toilets. And so it really means just that incorporating systems and designing the environment that benefit all people, and not just those with specific needs. In the workplaces, what I think I really appreciate from Sarah's sharing was that the rooms that were being designed can be used by anybody. So nursing mothers who need a quiet space for breastfeeding or pumping, to individuals who are overly stimulated and need a quiet place to just be on their own and decompress for a little while. And I love how it was labeled Thrive, and it wasn't just, nursing room or prayer room or quiet room. That is just a room that has been subtly put aside for anybody's use. And I think what really helps is having these kind of intuitive spaces that people can tap onto, and that communicates a lot in terms of just how much the company views people with diverse needs, and how there's no judgment, and how there's a lack of labeling. You don't label people who use the rooms. And I think those are really key in a universal design. I think in every day, it goes beyond the physical environment. Having plain language communication. Sometimes in our cultures, we tend to drop hints or we allude to, and this can be really hard for people on the spectrum or neurodiverse individuals to pick up, or even people who don't speak the native language or come from a different culture. There are a lot of undertones or unspoken rules. And when there's a lot of these, it becomes a bit unfriendly to those different individuals. And now that we're in a more globalized society, it really helps to speak in plain language and say what you mean. Try to be as clear as you can with your messaging. Things like having options or flexibility for, I think, working in different spaces. It also really gives empowerment to the individuals using the space, what works best for them. And I think moving a little bit into the policy area and how like the leaders may think, having a more open mindset in what it means to succeed and like what generates or like produces outcomes can be really helpful. So instead of presenteeism or like having a policy where people need to be at their desk, like to allow for flexible movement and working with individuals directly to ask what they need. Because I think a lot of times we try to design something from our own perspective and our own assumptions, and it really does help to have open collaborative conversations, I mean, with people from different areas and walks of life with different needs to be able to see what really works from their perspective. And having, I think, the goal of designing for everyone and designing particularly for the margin. So working with architects or designers who understand and know universal design is really helpful.
Thanks so much, Sandy. So we've covered the policy aspect, we've covered design in terms of designing spaces that work for everyone, but also, like as you mentioned, the everyday actions that individuals can take. But the last point you said about actually talking to the people themselves to understand what they're going through and how we can design better spaces. So very nice segue to our last question to Ashley here. So if you could share one thing with everyone here on this call today to support their neurodiverse peers, what is that one thing that they could do differently?
I guess it's being okay with the flexibility that comes with catering to these differences, right? So one of the biggest problems actually is the peer judgment, right? If they see you walking around in the middle of the day or like looking like you're zoned out for a period of time, then often it's that peer judgment, that discussion around what you need to do and don't need to do that causes most problems, right? Because it makes people feel a certain way. So like for me, I found it especially helpful because with my team back then, it was perfectly okay to take a break. It was perfectly okay to say, I don't feel like coming into office today as a valid reason, then have to think of an excuse, right? And so that, makes people a lot more comfortable to share with you than the deeper problems of why maybe they're not fulfilling some of the work that they're doing. And that flexibility also can have benefits because more often than not, I find that if I'm given time to ride the wave of distraction when it's work related, sometimes I come up with insights or ideas that probably will be quite creative to solving some of these problem statements that we have as a business. So that has benefited us. So I imagine if people would to try and do this for their colleagues or family members more often, then that would be quite helpful.
Thank you, Ashley. And so to summarize the three building blocks that we have spoken about today, the first one is inclusive policy. So if you are in HR or in a leadership team and you have the power to shape policies or different rules in the workplace or in your organization, that's one thing you can do to take into consideration how you can make things a little bit more flexible to the diverse needs of individuals. The second one is this concept of universal design. So it's not just the policies, but the spaces that we're building or the actions that we're taking every day to ensure that we're designing for the margin and making sure that it's truly spaces where different people can have their needs met. And lastly, for everyone else, there are already things that we can do today, whether it's being more flexible, it's having that empathy, or it's just being more open to having these conversations with people who are neurodiverse or who do voice that within your social circles or within the workplace, right? And so the last poll for everyone here today, if you had to pick one of these building blocks, whether it's policies, design, or the everyday interactions, what would you start with today? All right, as we have that coming in, I do want to shift already to the Q&A because we do have quite a bit coming in over here, if that's all right. And so let's see, the first one that we have here, sorry, panelists, are we good to shift to Q&A while these responses are coming in? Yes, okay. All right, the first one here is, what are tangible ways that we can foster joint responsibility that support co-regulation within working teams and colleagues so that both neurodivergent and neurotypical individuals can both thrive? So that joint responsibility. Maybe Sara, let's hear from you.
For me, it's really going to be about psychological safety. because it evens the playing field. It makes things discussable. The communication line opens, and it works for both neurotypical and neurodiverse individuals. And when I say creating a psychologically safe environment, it's not just motherhood statements. It's actually you have practices and tools like specific behaviors during meetings, like cameras allowed to be off. It's safe to have it off because, it doesn't work for you. For those who are not your stereotypical able to speak, sometimes we allow them, can you share your thoughts via chat? Because so that makes it a psychologically safe workplace where everyone truly contributes. So I think that's the angle I'd take on this question.
I'm actually curious to hear, right? Because a lot of what we're saying here is just understanding what different people need and creating the space for them to be able to thrive, right? But if we think about it in a practical manner, so I myself manage a team, and let's say that the different people in my team all have different needs. Tangibly, how would that work? Or what do you think, or what would you advise if an employee comes to you and is like, hey, my team is asking me for all these things, like what can I do? What would you say to them?
Actually, trust the team. Come up with a team charter. Make it co-created that everyone has a voice, like, team, what works for us? So once you build that trust in the team that everyone understands each other's difference and respects it, create that team charter. And I think I have a practical experience with this because I had a team member who had difficulty processing. It was really, the processing was slow. So what we did was, thank God for tools nowadays where you can have transcription. And then, so at the end of the meeting, we'd never assume that everyone understands everything. We actually always built in time during the end of the meeting, 5 minutes for clarification. And actually, we all look at the transcript together or the AI generated notes and see, hey, does this reflect the understanding? So it works for everyone. And what I like about it is you don't call out somebody's neurodiversity. It's actually equal playing field. So I think that's something we can play around with, Hannah.
Right. So it's just finding out what works, making it a team, like you're kind of even organizing like a little activity for everyone to chime in and just
Yes.
seeing what works and adapting from there, right? Ashley, if you don't mind sharing, so earlier you did also talk about how you voiced the needs that you had within the workplace, especially to your subordinates. But a question here, do you think it's worthwhile to tell your superiors about your struggle with ADHD? And this person personally struggles with the courage to do it themselves, and I can understand why. But what do you think?
I I believe that whether you should or not is less intrinsic and more about your external factors. So if anything, it's almost a test of your superior's character, right? So if you've worked with them long enough to know that you can trust them with information, and you probably can extrapolate this based on how they react to bad news unrelated to you, right? So over time, if you feel you can predict how they will respond and how they will help or not help you, then you can make a decision on whether you should or not. Because the reality is there will be workplaces that do not really accept this very well, or they would label it differently. And if you do find yourself in these situations, then you could also alternatively basically package your needs into other forms of messaging, right? Instead of putting a more hard label to what it is or what you're struggling with, you could just communicate that, this is a period that you work best in, or structure your meetings and times according to that. So it can be more covert and discreet if you find difficulty communicating that. Yeah.
Great, thank you. So it's also looking at the environment, which is what we're talking about today as well. Does your workplace allow for this? That's a good thing to analyze. And Sandy, maybe one last question here. So as a continuation from that question, do you have any experience helping neurodivergent individuals kind of navigate their struggles? And let's say if you're in the shoes of Ashley or working with someone like Ashley, what are some of the guidance that you may give them to speak up about the struggles that they may be facing?
Personally, I think Ashley's doing very well. And I think that in line with what you're saying, usually in working with neurodiverse individuals, we go with a two-prong approach. Like one is like how do we build in, I guess, scaffolds or like strategies to help them to cope with, let's say, environments that are not as friendly to their neurodiversity, because it's different for everybody. Somebody with ADHD may have very different needs from what Ashley has mentioned and from what it looks like in the video. And so it's to really understand for that person what's getting in the way and what are the outcomes that they have to deliver, and how do we do that and work towards that, what are strategies that may help. And usually for somebody with ADHD is to externalize a lot of the things, as you saw in the video, to have like visuals and cues. But I also work a lot on like trying to help them to see their neurodiversity as a strength, and also to see value in that. So as Ashley has mentioned, a lot of individuals with ADHD are actually incredibly creative. And there's a lot of strength and asset in their ways of thinking and how they view the world. Same goes with other individuals with different neurodiversity needs, right? So like for individuals on the spectrum, the autism spectrum, they also have very unique insights and unique viewpoints that brings a lot to the table. But unfortunately, most of the time it doesn't go heard because they worry about speaking out or seeming too different, and they have to navigate between what is acceptable and what's not. And so a lot of my work with individuals is to help them to first, see their own strength and their value, and how do we start to advocate and communicate that more effectively in their environment.
Thanks so much, Sandy. All right. And thank you all. I know we are at time. Thank you for staying a little bit over, and to all our panelists also for just sharing. And I hope that if you take away the key message for today is that we are all built differently. We know that, but how we can actually make the change and inspire the change in others is to really have more of these conversations and to just understand it better and work with neurodiverse individuals and in yourself as well to build spaces where everyone can truly thrive. Thank you again, and back to you, Aisha.
Awesome. Thank you, Hannah, and thank you to our panel for this important and necessary discussion. Well, folks, I hate to say this, but that's all the time that we have for this session. But before we move over to the next session of the APAC segment of Mental Health Festival 2025, I just wanted to share a couple of housekeeping notes. So we have a guide on transforming workplace mental well-being with practical strategies for leaders and organizations. So to see that, click the resource tab at the bottom bar of this window, and you'll see the link to download the guidebook. For those who want to rewatch this session, the recording will be made available on the Zoom Events platform and on our YouTube page soon. But in the meantime, please do help us fill out a short survey, which will appear on your browser after this session ends, and we'll take your feedback into account when shaping any future events. All right, so we'll be heading to our next and final session of the APAC segment of Mental Health Festival, How to Talk Back to Your Brain, CBT Tools for Daily Life, where we'll be learning simple but powerful cognitive behavioral therapy techniques from key experts. To join us, you can do so by simply returning back to the Zoom Events lobby page and clicking the Join Now button beside the session title. If you need any help, our team is available and the link is in the chat on the right-hand side here. So just to recap, please head back to the Zoom Events lobby page and click the Join Now button beside the session title. All right, thank you everyone. See you there.